Hello, and welcome back to the YouTube channel. My name is Etta Grace, and today I am interviewing Signe. I met her at the Columbus Book Fair, and I'm so glad to be able to meet her again to hold this interview. So first, Signe, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you write?
Oh, yes. So I'm originally from out west, but I grew up here in Columbus, Ohio. Let's see, I'm trying to think. Other than being a publisher and an author, my first friend from Ohio, she got me involved with coaching Special Olympics when I was 10. And it's since then kind of become my heart. Let's see, I'm a lover of adventure and the stories I read, the experiences I have, and the places I see. I'm primarily a short story and a short story writer and a poet. So those are just kind of some tidbits about me. Um, I appreciate other forms of art. Like I love to cook. I love to entertain. Working on trying to get on stage more, but that's a whole other thing. But those are some small tidbits about me.
That's cool that you have so many hobbies. Special Olympics is such a great organization to work with. I did a little bit with them when I was in high school, and it's always really fun to watch. And that's awesome that you spend so much of your time with that.
Thank you. No, I love it. They teach me a lot. It's fun. And they're also inspiring as well.
Mm-hmm. So we're here today to talk about your book, French Door to Foyer, which is a collection of poetry. So my first question was, do you have a favorite rhyme scheme or meter, or do you tend to write more naturally?
So I've actually never studied the different formats of poetry. Yeah, I had to ask, like I said, I had to ask a friend of mine what the rhyme scheme means and had it pointed out to me that, it's different formats. I even went to a recent poetry reading where they were discussing their favorite and I had to Google it. It's not something that I've ever even considered looking up. So when sometimes I get the question a lot where people are like, what kind of style of poetry do you write? And for me, I just say free flow because I don't really know how to fully answer that.
Yeah, I think free flow is a good way of describing it. When I read it, I would read my favorite poems out loud to myself, and they had a sense of like flow and rhythm to it. So I was wondering if you did that intentionally or if it was something that came more naturally. And it's cool that you don't have to be an expert at all the technical aspects of the craft and be all academic about it in order to still be good at what you do. Like I've taught myself how to write. I've never taken a single creative writing course. I'm an engineer by trade. So it's cool seeing another person do well in their craft without necessarily studying it.
Appreciate that. I am. Oh, so go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to answer you saying that it definitely came more natural. It was something that like in my head it flowed and I liked how it flowed, but it definitely was not intentional.
That makes sense. So my next question was, do you have a favorite poet or by another poet, or do you have any inspirations like books, media, or television that work their way into your poetry?
So my my poets that inspired me were Maya Angelou and Jewel. My mom got me those books as gifts when I was younger, and I consider their style a little bit more free flow, but they might actually have a style that I'm not aware of. But I just loved the way they spoke to the audience. So definitely that side of the poetry. But other things that inspire me, I tend to enjoy like movies and TV and books in the realms of like epic fantasy and sci-fi. And those stories I think have also inspired me as a writer. I also appreciate, I think a lot of different genres I try to pull from. And one of the things I love to do is I love to go out and with like might have like one earpiece in and listen to music and then kind of like observe the chatter in the world around me. So I try to find inspiration from everywhere. But for as far as your question, it's like a big kind of smorgasbord of interest in reading and mediums.
Yeah, reading and absorbing media from like diverse interests is something that I'm trying to incorporate more into my like book diet because I read like mostly fantasy and science fiction, but trying to expand into more nonfiction and poetry and things like contemporary and things like that has been really good for me to kind of expand that sense of what's standard. And so that's cool that you pull from so many different sources, and people watching is always fun too.
People watching can be a lot of fun and very interesting at different times. That's true.
Mm-hmm. So my next question is, do you have a favorite poem that you've wrote out of the book, or ones maybe that isn't in the book? But is there a favorite poem that you have?
Ooh, that's a good question. So initially I was kind of thinking about like from my book. I do have a current favorite one that I wrote for my second book called Giants of Wisdom, that I wrote kind of about the redwoods. But it's kind of in some ways a little bit harder of a question for me because when I published this first book, all of them mean something to me. And sometimes it depends on my mood. Even now with it being published, I'll read someone and go, oh, I can't stand this. Or the next day I'll read it and I love it and it's my favorite. But if I really had to pick one, I would pick Loose Vertebrae. That one for me, the first line in it, I came up with that long before I came up with a piece. And I just knew that I wanted it to be I wanted to be in a piece. I don't know if that makes sense. But so I worked a while in it. And sometimes as a short story writer, as well as a poet, I do image writing. And so I kept having these images in my head and I kept trying to play with it. So since that one took as much work as it did, because usually most of my poetry sometimes flows out of me pretty quickly. Whereas this one, I had to work at it. And I just really like how it all came together and it really fit the image that I was seeing in my head in trying to make it work. So I think that's why it's my favorite.
That's so satisfying that all the hard work paid off with that. And Wisdom, and was it Giants and Wisdom? The title? That's such a nice title.
No, I appreciate that. I was thinking about the redwoods. It's going to be in my second book.
Mm-hmm.
And my second book is pulling from a lot of more nature allegory. And so that one I was thinking about the redwoods and I was just thinking about how like we treat our world, but how we treat ourselves. And I was thinking about, I wonder what their perspective of us is. And so I kind of went with that.
Oh, that's so cool. Have you ever been to visit the redwood forests? I haven't traveled out that far west and it's on the list.
So when I lived the first 10 years of my life, I lived out west and I lived just like Ontario area around outside of LA. And then I lived about an hour south of Fresno in a really small town. And so I lived within an hour or two of the redwood, within an hour or two of the redwoods and within an hour or two of the ocean. So since moving more inland in Ohio, sometimes I'll miss, like if it rains and I'll smell like the salt in the air, I'll think, oh, I miss the ocean. But then other times I see pictures of like people around like hugging huge redwoods or talking about the trees. I'm like, oh, the giants, I miss them.
That's so cool. That sounds like such a neat place to grow up. I'm from Pennsylvania originally, and so we have much smaller trees there. But growing up in the forest and climbing trees is my favorite activity as a kid. So you can't exactly climb redwoods, but that's very cool that you're drawing from that personal experience.
I appreciate that. I will say, like, even though I moved here and I went to school in Columbus, I do recall being very good at climbing trees as well.
So my next question is, again, about the inspirations for your work. Do you pay attention to lyrics or take inspiration from songs especially, or would you put your poems to music as lyrics? As a writer, I pay a lot of attention to lyrics and I always put together playlists for my stories based on the lyrics. And other people do it based on vibes. And so I'm always curious about how people approach music, especially as a poet.
Actually, this is one of my favorite questions that you asked me because I love music and even though I have my different genres I enjoy, I'm predominantly very eclectic. So when I go out writing, it's usually I pick the music based on my mood. And sometimes I focus on the lyrics and the lyrics kind of help me I kind of get some image writing, like the piece in my book called Innovative Two-Step. I was pretty sure I was listening to an Imagine Dragon song. And then I just kept kind of picturing this scene in my head. And then I kind of tried to figure out how I could put it in poetry format. And then other times with music, whether sometimes it's EDM or it's blues or whatever, I will write based off of how that music makes me feel. And so the things I write, I try to interpret, I try to interpret how I'm feeling about a situation or viewing. But then if I'm observing people, sometimes I'm wondering, okay, I wonder how this makes them feel. And music helps me a lot with that. So I think it's both for me. But I can write to silence, but I predominantly write to music.
That's very cool. Imagine Dragons is a great band. Many of their songs are on my favorite playlists.
Yeah, they have some. They're very good at the way he does his voice. I think invoking emotion and into stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Bad Liar is one of my favorites. It's on my current Runaways playlist.
I have a newer one. I'll have to look at that. I'll have to listen to that one.
I think so. It might have come out a couple years. I haven't kept up with their newest music, but I'm not sure. So my next question is, do you have a favorite visual or emotion that you like to evoke that comes up regularly in your work, or a favorite word? You said that your second book is going to be very heavily inspired by nature. So I was just curious, do you have any specific scenes or things that come up a lot?
So I also really like this question. So this first book, the word that came up a lot was captivating. Sometimes my editor and I were like, let's kind of change up these words because it was kind of a repetitive thing. This one is like, I'm trying to think because it's still, well, it's in the first round of editing. It's also still, I'm still completing it. So it's not fully, I'm trying to think off the top of my head that words that I keep using in this one. I know that I use a lot of, I like to use a lot of sensuality, and evocation. I always mispronounce that word, but those two things, I feel like those two words, not necessarily using those words directly, but kind of using the meaning of those words to try to invoke those things into my pieces. Ooh, that is a really good question. I'm trying to think. So yeah, it's kind of like, could you repeat it again, please?
Do you have a favorite visual or emotion that you like to evoke that comes up regularly in your work, or a favorite word that you repeat a lot? So I guess you answered the word part, use captivating. But yeah, that makes sense that you'd want to try and evoke a strong emotion or inspire like an image or something for the reader to connect to.
Yes, I feel like sorry, go ahead.
I was just finishing. I think that's kind of what you're trying to say.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm trying to say. It's like, I know this new book has a lot more like a repetitive word. I can't think of it off the top of my head, but yeah, I do try to see how I can put the reader into like try to directly talk to them, if that makes sense. So I try to, like, on the back of my book, Marcus Blackwell, a visual artist, a friend of mine, he the way he describes my work and talking about how I like to describe how like focus on how things feel and not necessarily how they are or how they are seen. So that's you pretty much nailed it. I feel like I'm being a little bit more generalized, but sometimes I feel like sometimes I'm a little bit better in written form than I am in verbal form and trying to describe emotions. But yes,
that's all right. I think a lot of writers feel the same way. But yeah, I think having a specific word, like you said, the first book is trying to capture something. It's being captivating. It serves as a theme for the story, even if maybe don't reuse that word a lot and you edit it out, that theme still underlies a lot of the works. I know it was a lot of mundane moments like sitting and people watching at the bar or walking on an autumn day and crunching leaves, or like little moments like that you were able to capture and turn into the moment. And like that poem was just in that moment, in the present, which is something that I appreciated because I tend to always be like in my head, and being able to zone in and focus on what's going on around me and be grounding like that was what that captivation felt like to me.
I actually really appreciate that feedback because especially that first book, I think there was a lot of different themes that were happening in my life. And so when captivating was such a relevant word because I was captivated by grief, but I was also captivated by healing, but I was captivated by like just a new sense of wonderment. And so I appreciate your feedback and seeing that I was able to convey that.
Yeah, I think you did a really good job with it. And that kind of leads into my next question. You said this book is dedicated to two past friends in the dedication. And your preface talks about how it helped you to deal with grief, but it still has these very hopeful undertones of, finding wonder in the mundane moments of everyday life. So if you wanted to have the opportunity to share your friends' stories and talk about the writing process and their lives and kind of honor them in that way, I wanted to give you this space to do that.
I appreciate that. So the two people that are dedicated in my books, Jack Peterson, he was one of my writing mentors. He was a very successful playwright and director, a very talented writer. He always pushed me. He told me I had a voice And he was actually one of the people that really told me that I need to get on stage and that I have a natural talent. And I'm starting to get on stage, and it's still a hard process, but he never got to see that when he was alive. So for me, it's like, okay, now I definitely need to step into those roles now that he's gone, in honor of him. But yeah, part of the reason that writers group was influential in helping me realize that I do have a strong voice for people to share. So Jack Peterson was a wonderful human being who helped me with that. And then the other person is my late cousin. He was in his 80s. So I think he was like my second or third cousin. I met him in Norway about 2013, and we became pen pals. And I discovered that he was also a very talented poet. And his penmanship was amazing. So we would send letters back and forth to each other like once every 6 months. And then I had delayed sending a letter just because of life. And then this is around the time before I published my book, that I found out that he passed away. So I thought, well, I would like, in honor of him and also him being an amazing writer, I wanted to dedicate that book to him. So that's definitely like the first part of your question. And then I'm glancing at and then what was the second part of that question?
Just kind of talking about the writing process and how you worked those themes into the poems. It's very sweet. Having mentor figures is so, so important. And I'm glad that you were able to have those two presences in your life when you needed them. Being pen pals with an older cousin is such a sweet idea. I used to write letters back and forth to my great aunt. And that's something I should get back into doing. So thank you for the reminder.
No problem. No, snail mail is like, we get tons of junk mail, but whenever I get snail mail, I'm like, oh, what is this?
It's so nice to have like just a cute little postcard, and you can decorate them, and it's so nice.
Oh yeah, it's like a special kind of joy.
Mm-hmm.
But no, incorporating that in my writing style. So my cousin John, he died after I'd written the book, and same thing, both of them had died after I like technically had written most of the things. Like I wrote most of this first book 10 to 13 years ago. It was about 3 years ago when I decided to go towards publishing that this would be fitting to be the first one. So they both had kind of already passed, but elements of grief, because I was experiencing, trauma and grief during the time period that I wrote this book, those elements are still relevant, I think. But I think that was part of the reason why I dedicated it to them, because they never, like I had talked to them a lot about like publishing and going towards things, and then they never got to see it. So it was kind of just a way mostly to honor them.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. I'm sure they'd be very proud of you.
Thank you. I hope so.
So I had another question, which was about the writing process, but I mostly write prose. And so when we think about the writing process, you think about like outlining and then drafting and editing and, fixing grammar and story and stuff. But does that process look the same for you when you're like short stories or your poetry, or is there a different process for your poetry, and how does that creative process work for you?
So you're mostly talking about the editing process, is that correct?
Kind of like the whole creative process, but also editing, because you've talked about, this book is being edited. I'm like, how do you edit poetry?
Good question.
I've never considered that before, so I'm just curious.
So most people that I've learned that when I was looking into finding an editor, they don't usually refer to an editor for poetry as an editor. It's more of a proofreader, since poetry doesn't really follow grammar rules. But I will say with this one, so I kind of like to tell people that poetry, so with my short story writing, I tend to be more of like image writer. More collective. I take time to brainstorm and outline my kind of pieces that I'm kind of seeing in my head and write them out. Whereas my poetry, it's one of those forms of writing where sometimes I feel like I tap into my subconscious and I'm able to just flow, and it flows out. And, sometimes I have people say, how long did it take you to write this piece? And while I do have some pieces like Loose Vertebrae that took some time to create, a lot of them don't take a lot of time. And then it's really sitting down with someone to say, okay, I like the way that you styled this, but what if we took this word and we maybe changed it to like this synonym that like maybe pops a little bit more? Or what if, okay, well, what if we took this line out and or maybe we combine these two pieces? So it's more about, it's kind of like a collaboration in a way. It's like someone saying, just showing me things that I don't necessarily see, but not necessarily editing like you would with a novel or a short story. I will say the first two editors I went through before I found my current editor is that some of them kind of gutted me a little bit pretty good. And but that's okay because it was good. It's good to have that. I think it gives you a little bit of thicker skin in the writing world because it's better to have yourself kind of be gutted a little bit versus having publishing something that's not good. So, but when I found someone who, like my editor, he has a better vocabulary than me and he loves my work, but is not afraid to offend me. And so that was become a perfect relationship in that sense. But yeah, it's definitely like poetry is a lot harder to edit. Like my problem in this, not really a problem, but I think the reason why it took a little bit longer to edit this first book is one, I had written it so long ago, but two, I didn't have titles for them. And I kind of went back and forth and didn't like the idea of putting titles on them because as a poet, I consider myself an abstract artist in a lot of ways. And I don't like leading the reader into what I think they should get. I want them to get out of it what they're supposed to, or what they want to get out of it. But in understanding publishing, I get now why it's important to have titles but it took some time and a lot of work to try to, and I had a mentor give me another mentor give me a good way to solve that problem. He was like, instead of looking at what you should find for it, read it, and the first word that pops up and how it makes you feel, take that as a title. And so that's what I've done with a lot of them.
That's really interesting.
Thank you. No, it was a lot. It was really stretched me, this first book and publishing it, but that part of the creative process. So yeah, there's the poetry, it kind of flows out of me, the short story writing. And with this first book, even though it is poetry, I did try to incorporate elements of short story, but in a poetry format.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, that's really interesting that you had to go back and title all of them. I didn't think about that as being part of the process at all, but titling is so difficult for me when I come up with just like regular story ideas, much less titling an entire book of poems sounds like a daunting task. So
yeah,
that sounds exhausting, but it's cool how it turned out in the end. As a learning experience, if nothing else. And I'm sure the second book is going a little bit smoother than trying to adapt things that you wrote 10 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. Like with this second book, I find as I'm going through my document, I'm titling them in the moment or when I go back shortly after. And then I kind of been doing a little bit of my own edits or like asking questions so that when I sit down with my editor, and it's also fresh in my head. It's not like something that I wrote 10 years ago and he's like, what was your mentality when you wrote this 10 years ago? And I'm like, okay, let me like try to put myself back in that situation. So it's definitely I've learned a lot since then. And it's significantly a different flow.
Mm-hmm. And it's great that you found an editor that works with you. It's so important to find somebody who respects your creative vision, but is also willing to help you change it for the better and change it into like the best version of itself and not change it into what they think it should be. So I'm glad that you were able to find somebody who works well with your style and works well with you as a partner and somebody who you collaborate with.
I appreciate that. It's also something like my editors even conveyed to me that he's starting to edit in a different way than he edited the first book, where he told me that he's like, I wanted to be a little bit more safe in the way that I edited the first book, whereas this one, because he's also learning the process as well, because he's technically not a professional editor right now. But so we both have learned together in our editing relationship.
That's great. So you said you write prose and short stories. So do you find that your writing of poetry has affected your prose or vice versa in your style?
Yes. So it's kind of interesting because I know that prose can be much more lengthy in a lot of ways than poetry. But that's another thing that I really appreciated that Marcus on the back of my book, who had mentioned that I kind of like not quite poetry, not quite prose. I try to incorporate both. Mm-hmm. The poetry and prose. So I think that I like to relate to my work as being both, even though I think in some definitives, I've heard people say that it's not necessarily prose, it's more poetry, but in understanding how prose works and how I like to play with both. So I'm not really sure how to fully answer that. But I will say that like I said, I did appreciate that this review Marcus had given me, that my stuff kind of shifts between the two, because that's really how I feel about it too.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I know every prose author has different styles, and so there's different writers that have styles that seem to be more poetic. Like for a fantasy example, Brandon Sanderson, his prose
Okay.
is very like straightforward and utilitarian, and where he really shines is in his world building and character arcs. Whereas like Patrick Rothfuss' Name of the Wind has a lot of poetry and just the stylistic way that the prose is written, especially in is it Wiseman? The Slow Regard of Silent Things, which is Ari's book. It's like a short novella, and the most exciting part of it is like a diatribe about making soap. But the whole thing is told in such a stylized, poetic way that it's still really fun to read. And so there's different elements of poetry and flow and the way you describe things in prose that really can make an author's style what it is. And so I was curious to see how you adapted that to your own writing. And it's a part of the reason I've been trying to read more poetry is because right now my prose is very straightforward and utilitarian. I am an underwriter all the way. I have never once described a thing in my life outside of the edits. I always have to go back and fix the blank room syndrome. And so a big part of that is I want my descriptions to be more stylistic like that. And I think that you do a good job of conveying that in your work of being, halfway between poetry and prose. It's very easy to read. It's very accessible. And so that's a big part of why I really liked it.
I really appreciate that. Some of the authors in the books that you're talking about, I've actually read them. I'm actually in the middle of the Naval Wind, so I understand what you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
I will say, as a writer, I want to learn more of the technical side of short story novel writing, because those are the things that I struggle with. And I get that. I like that I have a natural tendency towards prose and poetry. I think it does help me with my imagination. But yeah, I think there's an appreciation for both sides. I think the technical side is important just as much. So that's something I need to work on with myself. But I appreciate the positive feedback, because even though I can't fully define between prose and poetry the differences, it's something that I try to do with my writing, and just really appreciate that it's being seen that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, being able to blur the line like that is pretty unique, I think. And everybody as a writer has their own strengths, and they also have, you never stop learning. You never stop growing and evolving in your art. It's a style. It's not something that you lock in and you're like, this is the technical way I have to do this to standards and tolerances forever. So that's cool that you're exploring that and continuing to learn. And I'm excited to see where the next book takes you.
Thank you.
So my last question is kind of a freebie. Is there anything that you wanted to talk about that I haven't asked you yet? Anything that you wanted to mention, or favorite things about your work that you wanted to bring up?
That one, so I know you had asked me that kind of earlier, and I was thinking that maybe it would pop up like in the middle of conversation, but I'm trying to think off the top of my head. I feel like you've really done a good job of asking me very thorough questions.
Thank you.
I'm not really sure. Do you have anything that's come up that you're interested in knowing more than what you've kind of sent me, or?
I think as I've had extra questions, I've just asked them in the moment. So I think I'm good, but thank you again. And I appreciate you spending the time to talk with me about this. Again, I'm looking forward to your next book. So where can readers find you on the internet? If you have any social media links, or where to buy your book or anything like that, I'll include links to all of this in the description of this video, as well as I'll write a transcript and put it on my blog. I haven't figured out closed captions yet. It needs a different file type, but that way a transcription is up for people who need it, and I'll have links there as well.
That's awesome. So my website, Signe-Cheer.com, and like my IG, I have two. I have Signature Publishing, all one word, was my business one, which is both for my Facebook and my Instagram. but I also have Sigonometry, which is my personal author page. Those are the two that I mostly use.
All right, great. Thank you so much again for taking the time to talk with me today.
Likewise, and thank you for having me. This has been fun, and I think what I really enjoyed about most interviews is just how I'm being challenged in the thought processes and the questions that I never even considered. And so it's been fun.
I'm glad that you enjoy the questions. I interviewed another woman, Amanda Aller, and she was excited that I was asking her questions specifically about her book. I'm like, of course I would ask you questions about your book. Why wouldn't I ask you questions about your book? Every author wants to ramble about their book. And she's like, you'd be surprised how many podcasters don't do that and just ask me like, what's your favorite food? I'm like,
Really?
okay, I'm gonna read your book and find out and like ask you thorough questions because that's what I want to do. But I'm glad that you had a good time.
Thank you. And I was just scanning my brain to see if I could come up with anything else to tell you about the book, but I think you really nailed it with the questions that you asked me.
Thank you. I hope you have a great day.
Thanks, you too.